The conference room at Hargrove and Mills smelled like old leather and money. The kind of money that doesn't announce itself, it just settles into the walls and makes everyone else feel small. I sat at the far end of the long table, the only one without a lawyer beside me. My brother had flown in his attorney from Boston. My aunt had too. Even my cousin, who hadn't visited Grandma in the last 4 years of her life, had someone in a suit whispering in his ear. I had a cup of bad coffee and a cardigan I'd bought on sale 3 years ago. Grandma had been gone for 11 days. I still expected to see her when I walked into her room. The attorney, a thin man named Mr. Calloway who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, cleared his throat and began. My grandmother, Margaret Louise Hargrove, née Whitfield, had built Whitfield Property Group from a single duplex in Phoenix into a real estate company with holdings across 4 states. Everyone at that table knew exactly how much it was worth. You could tell by the way they sat, straight backs, controlled breathing, the kind of stillness that comes when something valuable is about to be divided. To my brother, she left the commercial properties in Arizona, including the crown jewel, the Whitfield Tower in downtown Scottsdale. His jaw loosened just slightly. He covered it by taking a sip of water. To my aunt, the residential portfolio in Nevada, 3 vacation properties in Colorado, a brokerage account I couldn't see the number on from where I was sitting but watched her try to stay still about. To my cousin, the family home in Sedona. He exhaled. Then Mr. Calloway paused. He looked down at the document, then up at me, then down again. And to my granddaughter Nora, he read, I leave the contents of the safe deposit box at First National, account number ending in 4471, and a round-trip plane ticket to Portland, Oregon, departing April 9th. The room didn't laugh out loud. My family was too polished for that, but I heard it anyway, in the way my aunt adjusted her bracelet, in the half-second smile my cousin pressed back down, in the silence my brother chose instead of eye contact. My aunt leaned over to her lawyer and said, Just loud enough? Margaret always did have a sentimental streak. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time without starting the engine. The ticket confirmation they'd handed me was printed on thick cream paper, the kind that costs extra. Round trip to Portland, departing in 6 days, no hotel reservation, no explanation. My grandmother had never once mentioned Portland to me. I thought about throwing it away. I thought about it seriously, sitting in that dim garage, the sound of someone else's car fading in the distance. I had a job to get back to. I taught 2nd grade in Tucson. My students had a field trip the following Tuesday, and I had 23 permission slips to chase down. But then I thought about the last time I saw her. 3 weeks before she died, she'd asked me to come for the weekend. Not my brother, not my aunt, just me. We sat on her back porch in the evenings and she talked about things she'd never talked about before. About her first marriage, about a business partner who had betrayed her, about how she'd spent 30 years learning when to be visible and when not to be. You're more like me than you know, she said on the last evening, and I laughed because I was a teacher who drove a 7-year-old Honda, and she was a woman who had once closed a $12 million land deal over a lunch she'd paid for in cash. She didn't laugh back. She just looked at me like she was waiting for me to catch up to something she already knew. I found a sub for my class and booked a hotel in Portland for 2 nights. The night before I left, my brother called. He kept his voice careful the way he always did when he wanted something he wasn't going to ask for directly. I just want to make sure you're okay, he said. The will reading must have been a lot. I'm fine. Because if she left you something sentimental, a keepsake, a letter, that's meaningful too. Not everything has to be financial. I understood what he was doing. He was trying to get me to say it out loud, that I'd accepted the consolation prize, that I wasn't planning to look too closely at anything. I'll let you know what I find, I said, and hung up. The flight to Portland was 2 hours. I sat in the window seat and watched the desert give way to green, and then more green, and then cloud, and I thought about the safe deposit box. I'd been to First National once before, years ago when my grandmother had needed a second person present. I'd stood beside her while she signed documents and I hadn't asked what was inside because it wasn't my business. Now, apparently, it was. The bank was downtown, a few blocks from the waterfront. I took a cab from the airport and it rained the whole way, the kind of Pacific Northwest rain that isn't dramatic, just persistent. The teller was polite. She checked my ID, checked the account number, and led me to a private room. The box was larger than I expected. Inside was a sealed envelope, a small leather journal with my grandmother's initials stamped on the cover, and a business card that read, Whitfield Pacific Holdings, Claire Donovan, Managing Director, and a handwritten note below the printed number. She is expecting your call. Mention my name. I opened the envelope first. The letter was handwritten, 4 pages, in my grandmother's neat and unhurried script. She wrote that she'd been watching my family for years. Not with bitterness, she said, but with the clear eyes of someone who had made mistakes in the same direction and corrected them. She wrote that my father, her son, had been a good man but a weak partner, and that when he died 8 years ago, my brother and aunt had slowly repositioned themselves around her assets in ways she'd chosen not to confront directly, not because she didn't see it, because she was waiting. She wrote, I didn't fight them, Nora. I built something they couldn't find. Whitfield Pacific Holdings had been operating quietly for 9 years, a separate entity registered in Oregon, built from a portion of income she'd siphoned away before the Arizona board meetings could track it. Pacific Coast real estate mostly, a mixed-use development in the Pearl District that had tripled in value, minority stakes in 3 hospitality companies that were paying out steadily. The whole thing was managed by Claire Donovan, who had been her most trusted partner and who had been waiting for me. There was a line near the end that I had to read twice. The others will inherit what they always wanted, the surface of things. I left you what's underneath. I sat in that private room for a long time. The rain tapped against the one small window near the ceiling. At some point, the teller knocked softly to ask if I needed anything, and I said no thank you, and she left. I opened the journal. The first entry was dated 11 years ago. It was a record of decisions, properties, conversations. My grandmother's private account of building something in silence. The last entry was from 6 weeks before she died. The handwriting was smaller but still steady. The last line read, She'll know what to do. She always did. She just doesn't believe it yet. I called Claire Donovan from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring, as if she'd been waiting. Her voice was professional, warm, the kind of warm that comes from competence rather than performance. Nora Hargrove, she said, your grandmother described you well? I'm still processing, I said, which was honest. Take your time. But I should tell you, there's a development decision coming up that needs an owner's signature by end of month. When you're ready, we should meet. We met the next morning at a coffee shop near the office. Claire was in her early 50s, with the kind of steady presence that made you trust her before she'd said anything meaningful. She brought a folder of documents and walked me through everything slowly, checking that I understood before she moved on. The portfolio value was not small. It wasn't the kind of number I had vocabulary for. I'd spent the last 5 years teaching children how to count to 100, and here was a number with more zeros than I'd ever written on a whiteboard. I set the folder down on the table and looked out the window at the street for a moment. She never told anyone, I said. She told me once that secrets kept for protection aren't really secrets, Claire said. They're just timing. I flew home 2 days later with the leather journal in my carry-on and a folder of documents in my checked bag and a level of quiet that felt nothing like peace and nothing like grief. It was more like standing at a door I hadn't known existed and realizing the key had been in my pocket the whole time. I didn't call my brother when I landed. I didn't call my aunt. I went home, graded the permission slips that had piled up on my kitchen table and made dinner. For 2 weeks I said nothing. I went to work. I helped my students practice 2-digit addition. I called Claire 3 times. I read the journal from cover to cover and then read it again. I let the weight of it settle before I decided how to carry it. My brother called on a Thursday evening. He'd heard to our aunt's lawyer that the safe deposit box had contained more than a letter, though he didn't know what exactly. "I just think, for the sake of the family," he began, "we should be transparent with each other." "I agree," I said. He paused, surprised. "So what was in it?" "Something I'm still reviewing with her attorneys." "Nora." His voice shifted. The careful tone went away. "She was my grandmother too. Whatever she left you, we should all have the opportunity to." "To what?" He didn't answer right away. In that pause, I heard everything he hadn't said at the will reading, every politely dismissed suggestion I'd ever made at family dinners, every time he'd talked over me to talk to someone he thought mattered more. "She made her decisions," I said. "I'm going to respect them. That's what I'd expect from everyone else." I hung up. My aunt called the next day. She was less careful than my brother and more direct about it. She said that Grandma had clearly not been thinking clearly in her final months, that the will was unequal in ways that a court might find interesting. She used the word challenge twice and emotional manipulation once, in reference to my visits during Grandma's last year. "She asked me to come," I said. "You made yourself available in a way that wasn't entirely selfless, Nora." I thought about all the evenings on that back porch, about the way my grandmother had looked when she talked about the business partner who betrayed her, about how she'd said she'd spent 30 years learning when to be visible. "I'm going to hang up now," I said. "If you have concerns about the estate, please direct them to Mr. Trot Calloway." I signed the development papers Claire needed before the month was out. It was a mixed-use project near the waterfront, residential above, retail below, and the pre-leasing numbers were already strong. I read every page before I signed. I asked questions when I didn't understand something. Claire answered all of them. I kept teaching. I didn't announce anything to anyone. 3 months after the will reading, my brother called again. His voice was different this time. Not careful. Not controlled. He'd been contacted by a development firm inquiring about purchasing a parcel adjacent to a Whitfield Pacific project in the Pearl District, and someone had mentioned the Hargrove name in connection with Whitfield Pacific, and he'd started pulling threads. "You own a real estate company," he said. It wasn't a question. "Grandma built it," I said. "I inherited it." "For how long has this?" He stopped himself. Recalibrated. "Nora, do you understand what that portfolio is worth?" "Yes." The silence lasted long enough that I heard him breathe. "She did this on purpose," he said. "Yes. She built something with her own money," I said. "Over 9 years, and she left it to the person she trusted most. I'm sorry that's hard to hear." "That's not." He stopped again. I could hear him trying to find the frame that would make him the wronged party and coming up short. "What are you going to do with it?" "Run it," I said, carefully, "the way she did." The real reckoning came in June, 4 months after the will reading. My aunt had followed through on the word challenge, and there had been a few weeks of tense back and forth between lawyers. Nothing had progressed far. The Oregon entity was fully separate from the Arizona estate, and my grandmother had been meticulous, but it had been unpleasant. I invited them both to dinner, not at a restaurant, at the Sedona house, which now technically belonged to my cousin, but which he'd agreed to let me use for the occasion. I cooked, because I cook well, and I wanted them on ground that felt ordinary before we talked about things that weren't. They came because they were curious. My brother arrived first, alone. My aunt brought her husband. My cousin came because he lived there and didn't have the nerve to stay upstairs. We ate. I'd made my grandmother's short rib recipe, the one she used to make at Christmas when we were kids. No one mentioned it. But I saw my brother slow down when he took the first bite, the way people do when a taste takes them somewhere. After dinner, I set a folder on the table. "I want to be straightforward with you," I said. "Grandma built Whitfield Pacific over 9 years. It's separate from the Arizona estate, which you've inherited fully. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here because she spent the last years of her life watching this family pull apart, and she told me, specifically, that she didn't want me to continue that." My aunt's voice was cold. You're asking us to simply accept that she built a second company and hid it. She built a second company and protected it, I said. There's a difference, and I think you know what it is. My brother looked at the folder without opening it. What's in that? The last entry in her journal, and a letter she asked me to deliver in person if I was ever in the same room as all of you. I slid the journal across. He opened it to the page I'd marked. She'd written it 3 months before she died, when she still had most of her strength. It was addressed to no one specifically, which I'd come to understand was deliberate. She wrote about the family she'd wanted to build and the ways it had fractured along lines of money and pride. She wrote that she'd divided the estate to reflect how she'd been treated in her final years, not to punish, but to be honest. She wrote that she had not hidden Whitfield Pacific out of secrecy, but out of the need to protect something she wanted to give intact. The last paragraph was the one that mattered. She wrote, "I know some of you will be angry. Be angry. Then, when you're done, decide what kind of people you're going to be now that the money has sorted itself out. Nora will not rub this in your faces. She isn't built that way, but she will hold the line. I taught her that myself." My aunt set down her fork. She didn't say anything for a while. When she did, her voice had lost its courtroom quality. "She talked to you about all of this?" "Not directly," I said, "but she showed me who she was. I think I just paid attention." My brother looked out at the Sedona lights through the window. The sky out there does something particular in the evenings. Turns colors that don't have names exactly. Orange becoming something else entirely before the stars appear. "She should have told us," he said, not angry, just honest, finally. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe she'd tried and it hadn't worked." Nobody argued with that. My cousin cleared the plates. We had coffee. My aunt asked, carefully, how the Portland project was going. I told her. My brother asked about Claire. I told him she was excellent and that Grandma had chosen well. At some point, the conversation became something other than combat. When they left, I stayed on the back porch for a while. The same porch where my grandmother and I had sat in the evenings 4 months before she died. The air was warm and dry the way Sedona always is, even at night, and I could smell the juniper and something else I've never been able to name. I thought about what she'd said on that last evening, that I was more like her than I knew. I'd laughed because I'd been thinking about the Honda and the permission slips and the salary that made it hard to save. But she'd been thinking about something longer than that, about the quality of attention, about the willingness to stay quiet until the moment required otherwise. I pulled out my phone and sent Claire a message, "Ready to talk about the next project whenever you are." She responded in under a minute. "I'll have the briefs to you by morning." I went inside, washed the dishes, and thought about how my grandmother had sat in boardrooms for 40 years and let people underestimate her because she understood something they didn't. That the person who seems to have the least at the table is often the one who has been building the longest. The journal sat on the counter. I'd read it so many times the pages had started to soften at the corners. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a moment, and for the first time in 4 months, I didn't feel the particular loneliness of being the only person in a room who understood what had been lost. She had prepared me for this. Every conversation, every chess game we'd played on that porch, every time she'd said, "Be patient, Nora, watch the board." It had been deliberate. I hadn't just inherited a company. I had inherited a way of thinking. I drove back to Tucson the next morning. My students had a unit on fractions starting Monday. The permission slips for the spring science fair were due by Wednesday. Life was ordinary in exactly the way life is supposed to be ordinary between the moments that change you. I still taught school. I didn't think I'd stop. My grandmother had always said that what you choose to do when you don't have to do anything anymore is the truest measure of who you are. But on Thursday afternoons now, I had calls with Claire. I read the briefs she sent. I asked questions and then more questions and then better questions. I learned the difference between a property that looked good and a property that was good, and how my grandmother had built a career on knowing the difference before anyone else in the room did. 6 months after the will reading, I was sitting in a coffee shop in Portland with Claire when she slid a document across the table. "There's an opportunity," she said. "A small commercial block adjacent to the Pearl District project. The owner wants to sell quietly, no brokers, no public listing. Your grandmother passed on it 3 years ago, but the timing is different now." I picked up the document, read it through once. Then again, what did she say when she passed on it 3 years ago? Claire smiled. She said, "Not yet." I set the document down and looked out the window at the street, at the people walking past with their coffees and their umbrellas, all of them completely unaware of the conversation happening 6 feet away. "Make the offer," I said. Claire picked up the phone. Outside, the Portland rain started up again, soft and unhurried, the kind that settles in for the day without any fuss. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup and thought about a woman who had built an empire quietly, in a city no one thought to look in, and waited 11 years for the right person to find it. She'd been right about the timing. She was right about the timing. She was right about most things. I was still learning. There's something nobody tells you about being the quiet one in a family full of loud ambitions. You start to believe the story they tell about you. That you're too soft for the real world. That you're the sentimental one. The one who shows up to sit with people while everyone else is out acquiring things. And for a long time I believed it too. I was a second-grade teacher. I drove a car with a dent in the rear bumper I'd never bothered to fix. When my grandmother died and the lawyer read her will in that conference room in Scottsdale, I sat at the far end of the table in a cardigan I'd bought on clearance, and I accepted the fact that the world had organized itself exactly the way it always seemed to, with me on the outside, holding something small while everyone else walked away with something real. Except my grandmother had been watching. Not just watching me. Watching all of it. She saw the way her family had rearranged itself around her wealth the moment she got older. She saw the quiet repositioning, the conversations she wasn't supposed to notice, the way my brother always managed to be in the room when important decisions were being made. She wasn't fooled. She built a company from nothing once, and she understood exactly what was happening. She just chose not to fight it the way they expected her to. She built something else instead. Quietly, in a city none of them thought to look. I think about that a lot. The decision she made to not confront what was being done to her, but to outpace it. That takes a specific kind of discipline. It means you have to be willing to let people believe they've won while you're still in the middle of your move. Most people can't do that. The need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to have the room know you're not as weak as they assumed. It's almost impossible to resist. My grandmother resisted it for 9 years. What I inherited wasn't just the company, it was that lesson, the understanding that there is a difference between proving yourself and building yourself, and that the second one is the only one that lasts. Every time I wanted to call my brother after the will reading and say something sharp and satisfying, I thought about her sitting in Portland boardrooms while her family in Arizona congratulated themselves. I thought about how she had channeled every bit of what she knew into something that would outlast the argument. There's a cause and effect that runs through all of it, clean as a ledger. My grandmother paid attention when no one else did, and so she saw what was coming. She planned patiently, and so there was something solid waiting on the other side. She trusted the right person, Claire, and so the work was protected. And she chose me not because I was the smartest or the most ambitious, but because I had spent years actually listening to her. That listening was itself a kind of action, even when it didn't look like one. I still teach. I want to. But on Thursday afternoons now, I sit across from Claire with a folder of documents, and I ask questions my grandmother would have been proud of. I'm learning how to read a deal the way she did, not for what it looks like on the surface, but for what it's worth underneath. Nora, she wrote in that final journal entry, she'll know what to do. She always did. She just doesn't believe it yet. I'm starting to believe it.